Well, thanks, Leslie. So we're discussing AI and ethics on this panel. Very privileged to be joined by N.S. Nappinai, Supreme Court lawyer and the founder of Cybersaathi, has been doing great work when it comes to the legal framework surrounding AI. And Kashyap Kompella, he is an AI ethicist and an AI industry analyst. So between the two of them, I think we should be able to gain some fabulous insight into this space. So we only have about 20 minutes for this discussion, so let me not spend too much time on introductions and really dive straight into this. So for AI, and all the positive opportunities it provides, great transformation opportunities when it comes to businesses. And for a tool as powerful as this, there is also the other side, right? It does bring in risks. There are biases in algorithms. There are times that AI does go rogue. How do you reconcile these opportunities and risks in an ethical framework? While the beneficiaries of AI are many industries, many individuals, who is underwriting the risks that come alongside it, Kashyap?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Alisha. So just to put some context, this current wave of AI revolution that we are seeing started about 10 years ago because of advances in deep learning. Then, as we adopt AI more and more, we're also realizing in the last maybe 4 to 5 years that the systems have their limitations. So the perception is that we're automating decision making using these AI or machine learning systems, assuming that they're right 100% of the time or most of the time. But they're probably right 80% of the time. So what happens to those people or to those decisions that are incorrect 20% of the time? So that is broadly the downside of AI or this thing. So when we started automating using AI, we did not account for the fact that things can go wrong. So now increasingly we're realizing the need to put safety nets and guardrails when things go wrong. For example, AI is brittle. Like there was one quote in software which said, if we built the cities like how we built software, the first woodpecker that came along would destroy civilization.
Interesting.
So similarly, like one of the most powerful AI things that we have is called GPT-3. People would have heard of GPT-3. It's a content generation engine. So you ask it any question, it gives you a question. It gives you a proper response. I mean, almost human-like responses. But it was trained and its worldview has ended. It was trained on data that was available in 2019. So if you ask a question about COVID, which is the most pressing issue for us for the last 2 years. So you think about this thing. You ask the most powerful AI that we have about the most pressing question that we have. It doesn't know. It doesn't know anything about it. So these are the kind of things that we're grappling with. Second thing is like we have facial recognition systems. When we started wearing masks, all the facial recognition systems went for a toss initially till we recalibrated. So broadly, what are the harms? What are the downsides? This is that field we're grappling with.
Right. So thanks for laying down that overview. Nappinai, coming to you, can you walk me through what the legal framework is? How do you situate AI, when it comes to the law of the land and the fact that it's progressing and improving as fast as it is? Firstly, do we have a regulatory framework to actually locate all these systems in? And secondly, if we do, are they keeping pace or the current state of the law keeping pace with how fast the technology is improving?
Alisha, the standard answer you will always find if you even Google, do you have laws for AI in India? You'll get a standard response saying there are no laws for AI in India. Because often people assume that as things evolve, you need new laws to meet the necessity for that specified field. And therefore, unless and until something special, like a special law is formulated for AI, the assumption in the minds of people is that there are no laws. But law does not exist in vacuum. There is always, just imagine this kind of like this hole, and then something will always come in to fill it up. So effectively, how law works is, unless and until special laws are formulated, general laws become applicable. And therefore, when we talk about AI, AI is not just one subject. AI comprises multiple facets. So you could have contracting issues, you could have crime, you could have privacy issues, as Kashyap pointed out, the facial recognition aspect. Immediate thought that would come to our mind is privacy, right? So you know that in the Hong Kong riots when it could not read, AI could not read faces with masks, immediately they tried to figure out how they can scale up the possibility to make it readable. So it's a very intrusive technology. So what are the privacy issues? Then data protection. For instance, you've had instances where you had digital assistants listening to people's conversations in private. Because you made the mistake of putting a digital assistant even in your bedroom, and you were not aware that conversations were being captured and actual people were listening to it, right? So therefore, for each of these facets, you will need legal provisions and regulations which will tell you what to do and what not to do, and what are the violations, the penalties or the punishments that will accrue if you breach an existing law. So for that, the difficulty, the flip side of it is that you are going to be using general laws, and I call it in my book the cyber law jigsaw. I talk about how when it comes to the cyber domain, it's not like you have one law or one act which is going to capture everything. It's scattered around and you have to put the pieces together. So AI also follows the same pattern. It's a jigsaw puzzle. You have to be able to pull all these general provisions together to create the whole picture. Until some special laws may arise, but I can tell you right now, whatever will evolve also will be scattered around multiple legislations. You can't expect everything in one pocket for easy referencing.
Interesting. So, I mean, it's good to, sort of clarify in the beginning that there isn't as much of a vacuum as we've always imagined around AI regulation. And there are different pieces which different parts of the law will address. Kashyap, coming to you, you mentioned that when, people started using AI, they thought that this was going to be a technology which was superior, 100% perfect. But businesses, communities are now increasingly realizing that there are serious flaws. Right? There are serious errors also that happen which translate to people, let's say losing opportunities. There may be lives lost, let's say in the case of autonomous driving, just one example, if something was to go wrong. You also practice AI auditing, right? Because now that there are these risks, they have to also be, rectified and sort of, identified. Speak a little bit about that, perhaps, and help us understand, where are we in India, in our specific context when it comes to sort of recognizing these risks, and what are some corporate stakeholders doing to this effect?
I think that's a great question. So let me first talk about AI audits. So if I were to draw a parallel with, say, financial audit of financial statements, so now we take it for granted, but this whole profession started maybe only about 30, 40 years ago when the GAAP standards or FASB standards were introduced. So now it's a $200 billion industry with probably millions of audit professionals. So increasingly, as we're learning more and more about AI, I mean, I'm a big believer in the potential of AI to transform things, but what we generally underestimate is the pace of change. So all the hoped for potential of AI is going to happen, but probably that transition, according to me, is going to happen over 2 decades. Next, if you think about AI is like multiple things, as Nappinai alluded to. So there are AIs where the stake is probably, if AI misfires, it's a low stake. If you get an email, whether that goes into your inbox or spam, is a low stakes example. But if you're applying for a job and the job is not given to you, you're rejected by screening algorithms, that's a high stakes. Or a medical procedure, or granting of a loan, etc. So for those high stakes AI applications, so the manufacturer of that product makes a particular claim. It works in this thing. So how do you verify the claims of that? That is the domain of AI audits. So this is still a very nascent field. There are only about, there are a few companies or a few, like I said, the financial services audit industry is $200 billion industries, but the AI audit is currently probably about $10 million. So it's orders of magnitude lesser compared to that, but it's going to grow in the next 5 years or so. So there are a few organizations that are working, taking all the things, the flaws or the, not, I wouldn't say flaw, but I would say the gaps in laws and plugging it into a certifiable framework and saying, if you buy a packet of food, it says organic. How do we know it's organic? Somebody has gone and certified that it's organic. Or if you buy Nike sneakers, they'll say no child labor was used. Or if you buy a garment, it says no. So similarly, can we do that for AI? Saying, okay, it meets with all the criterion that it says it. So that is the domain of AI audits. And I'm happy to say that there are 2 certified AI auditors in India right now, and I'm one of them. So I'm really hoping that this takes off in the next 5 years.
Superb. So, very privileged to have, exactly one of those 2 people on this panel today. Nappinai, coming to you again, especially because you work within the framework of the law. One of the things the justice system also has to ensure is that, the biases in the algorithm, the risks of inclusion for certain communities, can be eliminated at the outset, right? While there is still a long way for AI to go and develop. What are the provisions that we have in the law currently to ensure that? And if you can cite a few specific examples, where something like this is being thought of.
See, that's a really difficult ask for government to come out with also. So when you talk about law, it broadly sets out what is it that you can do. It may also set out what is it that you can't do. And if you do what you're not permitted to do, what will be the consequences? Consequences could be civil penalties or criminal prosecution or both also, right? For instance, if you were to commit criminal breach of trust or breach of trust, right? So just to give one small example. Imagine trying to formulate a law for ensuring ethics in AI. And just to give a few examples before what is already there, So you have a woman going for a job interview and the AI is driving the interview and it's deciding based on how it has been formulated, and there is an inherent bias flaw where it automatically relegates female to, classic biased normative roles of cooking or, maternal care or whatever, and the male to salary and work and the earning member, etc. And if you think this is just a story, it is not, unfortunately. These are instances which have happened. And then it will automatically assume that this candidate is therefore not a good candidate for selection, or they will get marked down as opposed to a male candidate. So how does law step in to make sure that a discrimination doesn't happen? So effectively then what we are asking law to do is to not only point out what is to be done and what is not to be done, but also to avoid certain things being done. That you should not choose on the basis of discrimination. You should not discriminate on the basis of categorization such as gender, caste, community, language, color, race, etc. Right? So imagine a law having to be formulated like that, and it may seem impossible. Germany actually did it. When it came to autonomous vehicles, Germany put in a guideline for the for the manufacture of autonomous vehicles, saying that not just about what can be done and what cannot be done, but also what should not be done in terms of that you shall not discriminate on the basis of. So I think that's a classic example of what we may see. If you're talking about India, general laws don't really provide for something like this. Yeah. As and when a situation arises and given the fact circumstances, it will be fitted. We call it purposive interpretation. It will be applied to see how general laws will apply.
Right. So Kashyap, the onus of ensuring transparency will also lie on corporations, right? Whoever is developing this and deploying this technology. Let's take a recent instance. Of course, Elon Musk has gone ahead and acquired Twitter. And one of the things he said is that, there is a real case to make the algorithm public. You should know how it works because, it's a platform, which, many political figures are on it, different communities. So the question of representation, what gets amplified more or less, should be accessible and known to all. Do you think steps like these help?
Definitely. I think they won't solve the problem because specifically with respect to Twitter, the problem to be solved is a different issue than transparency. Because it is so heated, people say you're always favoring the other party. So if, say, the algorithm for content recommendations or content moderation is open source and people are going to see, then people will game it again. For example, people figured out, they didn't publish it, but if there is an image in a Twitter post, that gets more views. So people started putting images there. So then the feed became, less quality. It's not, high quality. The machine learning system learned that if you have a particular aspect to this thing, if it's a thread, for example, people, it gave more engagement. Or if it was a high quality image, it gave more engagement. So people learn these rules, they're not publicized. And then they game the system that way. So it does help in some ways, but it's always like a cat and mouse game. They publish the rules, then people will get ahead of that. And then again, LinkedIn, for example, you asked about Twitter. So LinkedIn, if you put a link in the, what do we say, a link in the post, it doesn't highlight it. So people won't put and say, okay, I'm putting a link in the comment below.
Right.
So people learn these tricks.
So
but it's a good step.
So what gives? People will learn. You're right to point that out. But then in Twitter's effort, let's say, towards transparency and responsibility, what gives? What else could they do?
See, the issues that Twitter decides are not technological issues. So what is free speech? What are the limits of free speech? I think vary from society to society. So I think this whole conversation of Twitter being a town square, that probably applies to a few countries in the West. In India, for example, Twitter is a niche social network.
Sure.
I would say. So what is, Nappinai would know this better than I do, but the attitude of the US Constitution towards free speech versus how they treat social media platforms is very different from the attitude in India. So it has to be horses for courses. And it's going to be always a trial and error in terms of we figure out as we play more with it.
Fair enough. I want to get your views on this also, Nappinai.
I'm very intrigued, on many fronts, but I'll limit it to the issue at hand on the AI and ethics aspect of it. The one possibility that arises, I don't know if this is just a bogey, but then you're going to make it open source and you're going to invite people's, participation in the evolution of this algorithm. Then is it likely to increase biases? That's the one thought that crosses my mind in this, and otherwise I'm quite intrigued and waiting to see. In fact, when I was giving an interview about this move, the first thing I wanted to say is that technologists will be rubbing their hands in glee waiting for this algorithm, the source code to be made public.
Interesting. Before we sort of wrap the panel, and we've discussed the challenges, I think, and situated them in our framework at present, but let's talk about the opportunities also, right? Like in the justice delivery system, let's say, what can AI do to help? Our time's up, so maybe I'll just take closing comments from the both of you.
I'll just quickly respond to what you said, and you're right, we have to look at the positive also. So you asked about whether law keeps pace, right?
Yeah.
So I can tell you that AI has been actually implemented by our own Supreme Court in 2017. So there is a case which is going on, which is of Prajwala versus Union of India, which deals with the uploading of, or to prevent the uploading of child sexual abuse content and rape and gang rape videos online. I'm amicus in the matter. In fact, I had proposed the use of AI. A technical committee was formed, and the outcome was that through consensus proposals, the participating tech companies agreed to evolve AI, which is called as active filtration, which will work on multiple parameters to be able to identify content like this, heinous content like this, and possibly block it at the stage of upload itself. And the balance we were trying to draw on free speech is to ensure that it will then be subjected to human intervention and if it is innocuous content, it will be allowed to be uploaded. It's like now post-COVID, all of us understand a quarantine. So effectively, it will be quarantined and then released or blocked permanently. So that order of the Supreme Court, which was of October 2017, now forms part of the intermediary guidelines also of 2021. And all of this was done more than 2 years before the world woke up to it. So in about, if I'm not mistaken, mid to end of 2019, G7 created a charter called the Charter for Cybercrimes, and one of the proposals they put was akin to what was done in the Prajwala matter. So AI can be an effective tool to fight crime too. Of course, there is always a fear that it can be misused or abused, and that the ultimate victim will be free speech, ensuring checks and balances, protecting against misuse, even whilst adapting AI for positive outcomes, is something we should consciously work towards. Eschewing it or avoiding it because it can have pitfalls would be a very negative way of looking at it.
Thank you. Very interesting example to highlight. Kashyap, a comment from you quickly.
Yeah, I'll just take 30 seconds. See, if you look at all the countries in the world, AI, the trust in AI is highest in India. Only 12% of Indians believe that AI is bad, while in other countries it's up to 45%, etc. So we should hold AI to a higher standard, checks and balances. And what we need is like AI with an Indian ethos. Research shows that when the team building AI is diverse, it leads to better outcomes. And diversity is actually a strength of India, so we should leverage that and build checks and balances for when there is going to be a downside. So that's my message.
Super. So that's a great prescriptive note to end on. And of course, AI is part of human society now, as it were. So there's only, there's only one direction it can take. It has to sort of evolve to a more, ethical sort of technology, and hopefully it will. And we'll reconvene and talk about it again. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you.